Think about the last time you got sick. You probably reached for a pill, called a doctor, or at least Googled your symptoms. You probably found an answer. You had options, you had access, and you almost certainly didn't think about how extraordinary that is. Because for the first 99% of human history, none of it existed. No pharmacies, no hospitals, no antibiotics. No doctors in any form you would recognize today. And yet the human race didn't just survive. For 300,000 years, your ancestors got sick, got injured, broke bones, caught infections, and they dealt with it every single day. And what they figured out, using nothing but time, observation, and consequence, is one of the most underestimated chapters in the history of your species. Let's start in the Italian Alps in 1991. Two hikers discovered a body preserved in glacial ice. Researchers named him Otzi. He had been frozen there for 5,300 years. And when scientists examined what he was carrying, they found something unexpected. Among his tools and clothing, he had two types of fungus threaded onto a leather string. Not food, not decoration. One of them was the birch polypore mushroom, Piptoporus betulinus. It has no caloric value. You wouldn't eat it by accident. And when researchers analyzed it, they found documented antiparasitic and antibacterial properties. Ötzi, it turned out, also had a whipworm infection in his gut. He was carrying a treatment for it. He had no laboratory, he had no pharmacist, he had 5,300 years less knowledge than we do. And he found the right medicine anyway. But Otzi is recent, historically speaking. In 1975, archaeologist Ralph Solecki published findings from Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq. Inside, a Neanderthal who had died 60,000 years ago had been buried with flowers. Not just any flowers. Pollen analysis of the burial soil showed clusters of at least 8 specific plant species: yarrow, groundsel, ephedra, and others. Yarrow is a natural antiseptic and anti-inflammatory, documented in medicinal use across cultures for millennia. Ephedra is the plant modern medicine extracted ephedrine from, still used in decongestants today. The interpretation is debated. Some researchers argue the pollen arrived naturally, deposited by wind or animals. But what is not debated is this: peoples on different continents who never met, never communicated, never shared knowledge in any way we know of, arrived at the same plants, for the same conditions, independently. That convergence is not an accident. Half a world away, around 1550 BC, Egyptian scribes recorded a medical document called the Ebers Papyrus. It is one of the oldest medical texts ever found. It contains over 700 remedies, many of them plant-based. One of them is willow bark, prescribed for pain and fever. 3,000 years after those scribes wrote it down in 1897, a chemist at Bayer named Felix Hoffmann isolated the active compound in willow bark, salicylic acid, and synthesized it into a more stable form. He called it aspirin, the most widely sold pharmaceutical drug on Earth, invented in a 19th century laboratory, known in a 16th century BC medical scroll, in practical terms, by people with no chemistry and no germ theory who simply noticed that chewing willow bark made the pain stop. They paid attention. For 3,000 years, that was enough. And they paid attention to more than plants. Ancient Egyptians also treated wounds with honey, packing it directly into injuries and infections. For a long time, historians viewed this as folk superstition. Then modern biochemistry caught up. Honey has 3 separate antibacterial mechanisms: a low water content that physically dehydrates bacteria, a continuous low-level release of hydrogen peroxide, and in certain varieties like Manuka honey, a compound called methylglyoxal that directly attacks bacterial cell walls. When Egyptians spread honey on a wound 4,000 years ago, they were performing an evidence-based medical intervention. They just didn't have the vocabulary for it. The mechanism was invisible to them. The outcome was not. But nothing in ancient medicine prepared researchers for what they found at a Neolithic site near Ensisheim in what is now France. A human skull, approximately 7,000 years old, with a perfectly circular hole cut into the top of it. The edges were clean, and the bone around the hole had healed. This person had survived the procedure. Archaeologists call it trepanation, the deliberate opening of the skull, used across Neolithic Europe and pre-Columbian South America to treat head injuries, relieve pressure, or address conditions like seizures and severe chronic headaches. And what shocked researchers was not that it had been done. It was how often the patients survived it. Across dozens of trepanned skulls from this period, survival rates range from 50 to 90%. 7,000 years ago, human beings were performing brain surgery, and more than half their patients walked away. How did they figure out that was the right thing to do? The answer is probably the same answer for all of it. They watched, they remembered, they passed it on. Anthropologist Kim Hill spent years studying the Ashe people of Paraguay, one of the last groups to maintain traditional healing practices into the modern era. What he documented was that elderly individuals, especially older women, held detailed working knowledge of dozens of medicinal plants. Which part to use, how to prepare it, what it treated, and critically, which ones were dangerous. This knowledge was not written down anywhere. It lived entirely in people. It was transferred from person to person, generation to generation, across thousands of years. And when someone died before passing it on, that knowledge was gone permanently, which means what we have lost is probably larger than what we have recovered. The World Health Organization estimates that 80% of the world's population still relies primarily on plant-based traditional medicine, not as a backup, as primary care. And a 2016 analysis by David Newman and Gordon Craig at the National Cancer Institute found that over 50% of all pharmaceutical drugs approved between 1981 and 2014 were derived from or directly inspired by natural compounds. Vancomycin, a last resort antibiotic used when everything else has failed, was discovered in soil samples collected by a missionary in Borneo. Paclitaxel, one of the most effective cancer drugs in the world, came from the bark of the Pacific yew tree. And artemisinin, the gold standard malaria treatment, came from a plant described in a 4th century Chinese medical manuscript. Tu Youyou won the Nobel Prize in 2015 for isolating it. The original discovery was written down 1,600 years before she was born. Your ancestors had no microscopes. They had never heard the word bacteria. They did not know what a virus was or how infection spread. They had no theory of the immune system, no concept of cells, no chemistry to explain why anything worked. And yet, across 300,000 years on every continent, they built a body of medical knowledge so accurate and so durable that we are still using it today. They didn't know how it worked. They knew that it did. There is a specific kind of intelligence in that. Patient, accumulated, tested at the cost of lives, carried in memory across thousands of generations. It doesn't come from a laboratory. It doesn't appear in a journal. It lives in the quiet observation of someone who watched carefully enough to notice that the bark of one particular tree made the pain stop. The next time you take an aspirin, you are completing a thought that started 3,500 years ago. Someone you will never know figured out the most important part. You are just finishing the sentence.